I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. A solo getaway, deep in a national forest where no one would bother me. Just me, my gear, and the peace and quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo trips before, so I wasn't nervous. In fact, I was excited. The drive took nearly 5 hours, most of it on winding mountain roads. As I got deeper into the forest, the paved roads turned into gravel, then dirt. My truck kicked up dust as I crawled along, following the faint outlines of an old fire road. I had picked this spot because it was remote. No trails, no campsites, just wilderness. The nearest marked trailhead was nearly 10 miles away. I figured I wouldn't see another person the whole time I was out there. Eventually, I found a clearing just big enough for my truck and set up camp a few hundred feet away. The trees were thick, towering pines and firs, their trunks black against the dimming light. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. As I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, I took in the silence. No traffic, no voices, not even the distant hum of a plane. Just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves. Perfect. The first night was uneventful. I cooked over the fire, read a book, and turned in early. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional snap of a branch in the distance, normal nighttime sounds. But at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had pulled me out of my sleep. I listened. Silence. Not a single sound. No crickets. No wind. Nothing. That deep, unnatural silence sent a ripple of unease through me. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. After what felt like forever, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the normal sounds of the forest slowly returned. I exhaled and forced myself to relax. Probably just my imagination. I eventually drifted back to sleep. I spent most of the next day hiking. No trails, just making my way through the forest, navigating by GPS. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air, golden light filtering through the trees. But as the day went on, something felt off. It was hard to explain, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like I was being watched. Every so often, I would stop and glance behind me, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. By late afternoon, I decided to head back. The walk felt longer than it should have, as if the woods had stretched while I was gone. Every few minutes, I swore I heard faint rustling behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By the time I reached camp, the sun was setting. I built a fire and forced myself to shake off the unease. I was being paranoid. Being alone in the woods can mess with your mind. After eating, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The warmth, the crackling sounds, it was comforting. Then, around 10 p.m., I had to pee. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped away from the fire, and walked a short distance into the trees. I did my business, zipped up, and turned to go back. And that's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the firelight, just inside the tree line. A man, motionless, watching me. He wasn't holding a flashlight. No gear. No sign of a camp nearby. Just a tall, thin figure standing completely still between the trees. My chest tightened. My brain scrambled for an explanation. A lost hiker? A ranger? But why was he just standing there? I raised my flashlight and shined it toward him. Nothing. He was gone. The trees where he had been standing were empty, swaying slightly in the breeze. My breathing was shallow. My skin crawled. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my pulse hammering. Nothing moved. No sound of footsteps. Just the crackling of my fire in the distance. I forced myself to walk, slow, steady, back to my campsite. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my knife and sat by the fire, heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined it? Maybe. But I didn't think so. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined him standing there, watching. Morning light brought some relief, but not much. I packed my things quickly, eager to get out of there. The plan had been to stay another night, but something in my gut told me to leave. As I loaded my truck, I took one last look at the woods. And that's when I saw him again, farther away this time. Just a dark shape between the trees. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew. He was still watching me. A wave of cold dread rushed through me. I slammed the truck door shut and started the engine. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled onto the dirt road. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I checked the rearview mirror once, and I swear, he was standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I never went back to that part of the forest. I told myself I had just imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me. But here's what I can't shake. I never heard him move. Not once. Not when he disappeared. Not when he followed me. And I keep wondering, how long had he been watching me before I even noticed? Camping had always been a way for me to escape. There was something about being away from the city, away from people, just surrounded by trees and open sky, that reset my mind. My best friend, Matt, felt the same way. We had been camping together for years, always choosing the most remote spots we could find. We liked the isolation, the quiet, the feeling of having nothing but nature around us. This trip was no different. We had planned a 3-day camping trip in a national forest, choosing a site near a small, unmarked lake. It was about a 4-hour hike from the nearest road, and as far as we knew, no one else would be anywhere near us. We had scouted the area months before and found a perfect clearing for our tents, close to the water but surrounded by thick trees for cover. We set out early, our backpacks heavy with gear and supplies. The hike was tough, the summer heat making the uphill sections brutal. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were birds calling and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents side by side with a small fire pit between them. Matt gathered firewood while I filtered water from the lake. By nightfall, we had a good fire going, and we sat beside it, eating canned chili and talking about nothing in particular. It was peaceful, until we heard the footsteps. At first, we ignored them. It was subtle, just the occasional crunch of leaves somewhere beyond the firelight. Probably an animal, we figured. A deer, maybe. The forest was full of them. But then, as the fire burned lower, the footsteps became more distinct. Not quick, like an animal moving through underbrush. Slow, measured, deliberate. I looked at Matt, and he looked at me. We didn't say anything, but I could tell we were thinking the same thing. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing but darkness. The trees cast strange, jagged shadows, but no sign of movement. Then, just as I turned the light away, crunch. A single step. Close. Too close. I swung the light back, but there was nothing there. Probably just a deer, Matt said, though his voice was quieter than before. I nodded, forcing myself to believe it, but something felt off. The fire crackled, sending flickering light over the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, that we were alone out here, that there was nothing to be afraid of. I was wrong. We stayed by the fire a while longer, trying to act normal, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt different, like it was watching us. We finally decided to turn in for the night. Matt doused the fire while I double-checked our food bag, making sure it was tied up high in a tree away from animals. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, it wasn't just a single step. It was a slow, steady circle, someone walking around our campsite. Not rushing, not running, just moving. I froze, my hand gripping the rope. The sound was unmistakable. Boots on dry leaves. "Matt," I whispered. He looked at me, his face pale in the dim light. He had heard it too. We both stood there listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, crunch. Behind me. I spun, flashlight shaking in my hand, but the beam caught nothing but trees. Matt cursed under his breath. What the hell is going on? I didn't answer. I didn't know. We stood there for what felt like forever, listening. But the sound never came back. Finally, Matt exhaled sharply. Screw it. Let's get in the tents. Neither of us wanted to admit we were scared. But we were. I zipped my tent shut, my knife within arm's reach. The fabric felt impossibly thin, offering no real protection against whatever was out there. I lay awake, listening. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No crickets. No wind. Just silence. Then, in the middle of the night, crunch, right outside my tent. I stopped breathing. I could hear it. Soft, slow steps moving between our tents. Not an animal. A person. I squeezed my knife handle so tightly my hand hurt. My heartbeat was deafening in my ears. I wanted to call out to Matt, but I was too afraid to make a sound. Then, the zipper on Matt's tent moved. Not unzipping. Just a slow, testing pull. Matt shot up inside his tent. I heard his breath hitch. Then suddenly silence. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I lay there, my muscles locked, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up, it was just after dawn. The pale light filtered through the trees, making everything look unreal. I sat up, feeling groggy, my body stiff from tension. Then I saw Matt already outside, standing completely still, staring at the ground. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, and my stomach dropped. There were footprints, dozens of them, all around our tents. Not boot prints, bare feet. Whoever had been out there had no shoes. I swallowed hard. We're leaving. Matt nodded, already packing his gear. Neither of us spoke as we tore down camp in record time. The whole hike back, I felt like we were being watched. I kept checking behind us, but there was never anyone there. When we finally reached the road, we threw our gear in the car and got inside. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. We never went back to that campsite, and we never spoke about it again. But I still think about those footprints, and I wonder, how long had they been watching us? I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. My brother Jake and I had planned it meticulously, 3 days, deep in the woods, away from civilization. No cell service, no people, just the two of us and nature. The hike-in was brutal. The air was thick with humidity, and sweat soaked through my shirt by the time we reached the small clearing we had picked out on the map. It was perfect. Surrounded by dense trees, a small stream nearby for water, and most importantly, it was secluded. We set up camp quickly. Our tent, an old 2-person dome tent, sat close to the tree line while we built a fire pit in the center of the clearing. It felt like home, a temporary one, but still comfortable. By the time the sun began to dip below the trees, we had a roaring fire and a small meal cooked. We ate in silence, just enjoying the peace. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. That night, I slept like a rock. No strange noises, no disturbances, just the cool night air and the distant crackling of dying embers. Everything felt perfect. I woke up in the middle of the night, needing to pee. The kind of urgent need that you can't ignore. Grumbling, I unzipped my sleeping bag and sat up. Jake was snoring softly next to me. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and stepped outside. The fire was out, just faint red embers glowing in the ashes. The night was darker than I expected, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I walked a few steps away from the tent, did my business, and turned back toward camp. That's when I froze. The clearing was empty. No fire pit, no backpacks, no tent, nothing. I stood there, blinking, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. I had just stepped out of our tent. Jake had been inside, snoring. Our gear had been right there. But now there was nothing. The clearing was smooth, undisturbed, as if no one had ever camped there. The fire pit was gone, no ashes, no sign of burned wood. I took a shaky breath and told myself I had to be dreaming. Or maybe I had gotten turned around in the dark. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the area. My heart hammered as the light swept over the clearing. Nothing. The trees stood tall and still, silent witnesses to whatever had just happened. I turned in circles, my breath quickening. The tent had been right here. I took a step forward, then another, trying to find anything that would prove I hadn't lost my mind. My foot landed on something soft, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was my sleeping bag. I bent down and picked it up. It was zipped up, still warm, as if I had just been sleeping in it. But there was no sign of the tent, no sign of Jake. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to breathe. I needed to find Jake. Now, I shined my flashlight at the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The silence was overwhelming, pressing in on me from all sides. Then I heard it, a soft rustling in the trees. Slow, deliberate. I whipped my flashlight toward the sound, my pulse hammering. Nothing. I took a shaky step forward. The leaves crunched under my boots, loud in the eerie quiet. Jake! My voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. Jake! The rustling stopped. The forest felt even quieter. I turned in circles, my light trembling in my grip. Where the hell was my brother? Then I heard footsteps. Not mine. Not an animal. Human footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming closer. I didn't wait to find out who, or what, it was. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the forest floor, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. Branches tore at my arms and face as I pushed through the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was going. The trail we had used to hike in was gone. Everything was gone. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs ached. Then finally I stopped. I doubled over, gasping for air. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm. The beam wavered, then steadied. I was alone. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was silent again. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. My first priority was finding Jake. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. A faint light in the distance. A campsite? Another hiker? I didn't care. I just needed to find someone. I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward the glow. As I got closer, the light grew brighter. It was definitely a campfire. Relief flooded through me. Maybe Jake had found another group. Maybe he had woken up confused, wandered off, and ended up here. I stepped into the clearing, my breath catching in my throat. I saw the fire pit, the familiar backpacks, and then my tent, our campsite, exactly as we had left it. I stood there, stunned, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I had just come from here. It had been empty. I turned, looking back the way I had come. Darkness, trees, nothing else. My sleeping bag was still in my arms. I dropped it and stepped forward cautiously, scanning the tent. Jake! My voice was hoarse. Silence. I reached for the zipper and slowly pulled it down. The tent was empty. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, watching the trees. Jake never came back. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know where I went when I stepped out of the tent, or why everything disappeared. But when the sun rose, I packed up and hiked out. I never saw Jake again. I filed a report with the rangers. They searched for weeks. No trace of him was ever found. And the strangest part, when they took me back to the site where we had camped, they told me no one had ever camped there before. The drive into the forest had been long, nearly 4 hours from the nearest town. I had chosen this campsite specifically because of its remoteness. No people, no noise, just pure solitude. The forest was dense, towering pine trees stretching in every direction, the late afternoon sun filtering through the canopy in golden streaks. I parked my truck on the side of the narrow dirt road and grabbed my gear. The actual campsite was about half a mile in, a clearing next to a small, slow-moving creek. The hike-in was easy, though the silence of the place was almost unsettling. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent near the creek, about 20 feet from the fire pit left by previous campers. The firewood was already prepped. Someone had left a neat stack of dry logs, which was a welcome surprise. As I built the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was an odd sensation, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness and pushed the thought aside. By nightfall, the fire crackled warmly, pushing back the darkness. I sat on a log, eating a simple meal and enjoying the stillness. I had been looking forward to this, just me, nature, and the soft, ambient noise of the forest. It was sometime past midnight when I noticed it. The fire had burned low, flickering against the trees, their long shadows stretching and shifting with the flames. I had been staring into the embers, lost in thought, when something felt off. The shadows moved with the firelight, stretching and shrinking as expected. Except for one. It was tall and still, darker than the others. My eyes adjusted, and a cold chill ran down my spine. It was human-shaped. I blinked hard. The shadow didn't move. The fire flickered, shifting all the other shadows around it. But that one remained in place, unnaturally still. It was cast against a tree about 30 feet away, as if someone was standing there. But there was no one there. I stood up slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The night was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. I picked up my flashlight, took a deep breath, and aimed it directly at the shadow. Nothing. Just the empty tree. The moment the light hit it, the shadow vanished, but at that exact second, I heard it. Running. Fast, crashing footsteps tearing through the underbrush, moving away from me. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the flashlight wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, had been standing there. The sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the deep forest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. There was no way I was sleeping after that. I hadn't slept. Every tiny sound outside the tent made my body go rigid with fear. The fire had burned out completely, and I sat there in the dark for hours, knife in hand, listening. As soon as the sky lightened, I forced myself out of the tent. The forest looked different in the morning, less threatening, more peaceful. But the unease lingered. I walked to where I had seen the shadow and found footprints. They were barefoot. The prints led into the trees and disappeared into the undergrowth. I followed them a few steps, but the logical part of me knew better than to go any deeper. I debated leaving. Something about this place felt wrong. But at the same time, it could have been my imagination playing tricks on me. Sleep deprivation, the flickering firelight. Maybe I had spooked myself for nothing. I convinced myself to stay. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the fear from the night before. By the time I got back to camp in the late afternoon, the forest felt normal again. But as the sun dipped below the trees, my anxiety returned. I built a bigger fire that night. It felt safer somehow, the flames higher, the light pushing back the darkness a little farther. I kept my flashlight and knife within arm's reach. Hours passed and nothing happened. I started to relax, convincing myself that I had overreacted. Then, just past midnight, I felt it again. That off feeling. I turned my head slowly toward the trees. It was back. The shadow. Exactly where it had been the night before. Unmoving. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. My breathing was too loud in my ears. I didn't want to shine the flashlight at it again. I didn't want to hear those footsteps running away. I forced myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight, hands shaking, and turned it on. The shadow vanished. But this time, the footsteps didn't run. This time, they moved toward me. I heard them, deliberate and slow, crunching through the dry leaves. Coming closer. I jumped to my feet, my flashlight sweeping frantically through the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, frozen, my own breath coming fast and shallow. The forest was silent again. Then just barely audible breathing. It was close. So close. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag, threw dirt over the fire, and ran. I didn't pack my tent, didn't take anything but my backpack and flashlight. I just ran, crashing through the woods like a terrified animal, my mind screaming at me to move faster. By the time I reached my truck, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I locked the doors, turned on the headlights, and scanned the road behind me. Nothing. I gunned the engine and tore out of there, gravel flying behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway, only then realizing how drenched in sweat I was. I never went back for my tent. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it a person? Someone messing with me? But why would they be barefoot? And how had they moved so silently until I shined my flashlight? I don't camp alone anymore. Camping had always been something I loved. It wasn't about adventure or proving anything. I just enjoyed the quiet. No traffic, no crowds, no constant digital noise. Just nature. That's why, when my friend Daniel suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the forest, I immediately agreed. We had camped together dozens of times before, always picking secluded spots where we wouldn't see another soul. This time was no different. We chose a place far from the main trails, a thickly wooded area at the base of a small mountain. It was perfect. Tall trees, soft ground for the tent, a little stream nearby for water. We set up camp, built a fire, and cooked dinner as the sun dipped behind the trees. As the night set in, the forest around us became a wall of darkness. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows against the trunks of the surrounding trees. We talked about nothing in particular, work, life, past camping trips. It was peaceful. By midnight, we decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cold night air settled around us. Our tent was a large, two-person dome tent with a single zippered entrance. Inside, we laid out our sleeping bags, zipped up the tent, and got comfortable. I fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The air inside the tent was still and quiet, but something felt off. A deep sense of unease crawled through my chest. Then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone speaking in another room. I turned my head slowly toward Daniel's side of the tent. I could barely make out his sleeping bag in the darkness. He was facing away from me, completely still. The whispering continued. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't leaves rustling or the distant hoot of an owl. It was human. Words, soft and low, muttered just beyond understanding. I strained my ears, trying to make out what was being said, but it was too quiet. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the silence that followed. The forest outside was completely still. No wind, no animals, nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been dreaming. I turned over and forced myself to relax. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The second time I woke, it was different. The whispering was inside the tent. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the voice was no longer muffled by the fabric walls. It was here, with us. The words were still unintelligible, a soft murmur threading through the darkness. My skin prickled as I felt the air in the tent shift, like someone was moving. I turned my head ever so slightly toward Daniel, my pulse hammering in my ears. He was awake. His wide eyes stared at me in the dim light, pupils blown wide with fear. He had heard it too. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The whispering continued. It was right between us. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but I was terrified of what I might see. My fingers twitched toward my bag, barely inches from where I lay. Then silence. The whispering cut off so suddenly that the absence of sound felt even more terrifying. The tent was still. The forest outside remained unnervingly quiet. Daniel and I just lay there, staring at each other, breathing fast but trying not to make a sound. My mind raced through explanations. An animal? The wind? A prank? No, none of that fit. This was inside the tent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to whisper. "Did you hear that?" Daniel gave the slightest nod. His face was pale even in the darkness. "Is someone out there?" I whispered again. He hesitated, then shook his head. "It was in here," he mouthed. I swallowed hard and reached for my flashlight. My fingers fumbled against the fabric of my sleeping bag as I gripped the small, reassuring weight of the light. I turned it on. The inside of the tent flooded with dim, yellowish light. Nothing. No one. Just two sleeping bags, two backpacks, and the zippered entrance still completely closed. Daniel sat up, breathing heavily. What the hell was that? I shook my head, trying to force my thoughts into some kind of order. I don't know. It was like I hesitated, like someone was talking. Right here. We both scanned the tent, but there was nowhere for anyone, or anything, to hide. I checked the zipper. It was fully secured. Nothing had entered or exited. Outside, the forest remained completely, unnaturally silent. "We're leaving," Daniel muttered. He wasn't asking. I nodded. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, stuffing things into our packs as fast as we could. Neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung thick in the air. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, something caught my eye. The tent fabric, right above my pillow. A small, dark stain, almost like a single fingerprint, smudged onto the inside of the tent. We tore down the tent in record time. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my nerves jolt. As we hiked back, the forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. Every so often, I swore I could hear something, a faint whisper carried on the cold night air. Daniel heard it too. Neither of us looked back. We reached my truck just as the first light of dawn broke over the treetops. Without a word, we threw our gear into the back and climbed inside. I started the engine, heart still racing. As we pulled away, I glanced at the forest in the rearview mirror. For the briefest second, I thought I saw something. A figure, standing between the trees, motionless, watching, and then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I drove faster. We never went back to that forest. We never spoke about that night to anyone. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, I swear I still hear it. A whisper, so soft, just beyond understanding. Camping in the deep woods was something I had done countless times before. I wasn't afraid of the dark, of animals, or of being alone. But after that trip, I realized there were things out there. Things that weren't supernatural but were just as terrifying. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway with my friend Mark. We had planned it a few weeks in advance, picked a secluded spot near a small river, and packed enough food and supplies for 2 nights. The area was remote, about a 6-hour drive from the nearest town, and then a 3-hour hike into the woods. Perfect for what we wanted: peace, quiet, and escape from the noise of life. We got there in the late afternoon on a Friday. The hike was exhausting, but the spot we found made it worth it. A small clearing right by the river, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The sun was still high, casting long shadows, but the air was cool. The only sounds were the water rushing over rocks and the occasional rustling of leaves. As we set up camp, I noticed another tent about 50 yards away, nestled between some trees. It wasn't unusual to see other campers in the woods, even in a remote place like this. The guy camping there was alone, probably in his mid-40s, with short graying hair and an average build. He gave us a polite nod when we arrived, but didn't say much. We finished setting up our tent, gathered some wood, and built a fire as the sun dipped below the treeline. The man wandered over just as we were cooking dinner. "Nice spot," he said. "Yeah, not bad," Mark replied. The man introduced himself as Dave. Said he had been camping out here for a couple of nights already and planned to leave in the morning. He was friendly enough, though something about him felt a little off. His expression never changed much, and his eyes seemed to linger on things longer than necessary. We made small talk, where we were from, our favorite hiking trails, things like that. He didn't talk about himself much, just kept asking us about our plans, how long we were staying, and if anyone knew we were out there. After about 20 minutes, he said goodnight and walked back toward his tent. We watched him go, expecting to hear the sound of his tent unzipping. It never came. Instead, he just stood there. The fire cast shadows through the trees, flickering against the outline of his body. He was facing his tent, standing still, like he was thinking about something. Then slowly, he turned his head. Not his body, just his head, turning it back toward us. Watching, neither Mark nor I said anything. We just sat there, pretending not to notice. But my skin crawled. Something about the way he stood, the way he turned his head without moving the rest of his body. It was wrong. Minutes passed. Finally, he moved, stepping out of sight into the trees. But instead of unzipping his tent, we heard footsteps. Not walking away, just moving, circling. I looked at Mark. He was staring at the fire, jaw tight. He heard it too. "Maybe he's looking for something," I whispered. Mark didn't respond. We stayed up for a while, listening. The footsteps would stop, then start again. Sometimes close, sometimes further away. But he never went inside his tent. Eventually, Mark mumbled something about being exhausted and went to the tent. I stayed by the fire a little longer, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the firelight made things look weirder than they were. But as I sat there, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I scanned the trees, heart hammering. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. Somewhere. Standing still. Watching. I put more wood on the fire and forced myself to calm down. I was being paranoid. That's all. Eventually, I went into the tent, zipped it shut, and lay down. I barely slept. Morning came, and Dave's tent was still there. But Dave was nowhere to be seen. Think he left. I asked Mark as we made breakfast. Mark shrugged. Didn't hear him leave. We walked over to check. The tent was zipped shut, but his gear was still outside: boots, a small cooking pot, even a half-full water bottle. Who leaves their stuff behind? I muttered. Mark knocked on the tent fabric. "Hey man, you out here?" No response. He knocked again. Nothing. We looked at each other. The tent was there, his stuff was there, but he was gone. Maybe he went for a morning hike. We didn't think much more about it. We spent the day fishing and hiking a little further downriver. By the time we got back, the sun was getting low. Dave's tent was still there, untouched. And that's when I noticed it. The tent wasn't positioned the same way as before. It had moved slightly, just enough that I was sure something was different. Mark saw it too. Dude, did he come back? I had no idea. That night, we built the fire bigger than before. We sat close, keeping our knives handy, trying not to let our unease show. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps in the darkness, just outside the reach of the firelight. Coming closer. I gripped my knife. Mark did the same. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice. Not loud. Not calling out. Just a quiet, almost whispered voice. "You boys should have left today." Every hair on my body stood up. Mark's breathing was slow and controlled, but I could tell he was just as tense as I was. Neither of us responded. Then we heard something dragging across the dirt. A long, scraping sound. We bolted for the tent. Neither of us was willing to sit out there any longer. We zipped it shut and listened. For hours, we heard footsteps outside. Sometimes close, sometimes far. Then just before dawn, a long, slow exhale. Right outside the tent. A sigh. And then nothing. The moment the sun came up, we packed everything in record time. Dave's tent was still there, but we didn't check it again. We just grabbed our gear and started the hike back. The whole way out, we kept looking over our shoulders. At one point, Mark stopped and grabbed my arm. His face had gone pale. "Look." I followed his gaze. Just off the trail, partially hidden behind the trees, was Dave's tent. He had moved it. We hadn't imagined it. That night, he had been closer to us. We hiked faster. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear inside and locked the doors. Mark turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Neither of us spoke until we were miles away. Only then did Mark say what we had both been thinking. There was never anything inside that tent. I nodded, because now that I thought about it, I realized something chilling. We had never seen him unzip it. Camping alone in the desert is supposed to be peaceful. Just you, the open sky, and the quiet emptiness stretching for miles in every direction. That's why I chose it. I wanted to be alone. No city noise, no other people, just silence. It was late September, and I had driven out to a remote area in the southwest, far from any towns or major roads. I parked my truck at the edge of a dry wash, shouldered my backpack, and started hiking deeper into the wilderness. The sun was relentless, but I had enough water and supplies for a couple of nights. By the time I found a decent spot, the sky had started turning orange. The land around me was a mix of rocky outcrops and sparse desert shrubs. A few Joshua trees stood twisted and unmoving in the distance. It was perfect, secluded, still empty. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered a small pile of dry brush for a fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert came alive with subtle sounds, the occasional chirp of an insect, the faint rustling of wind through brittle branches. I ate a simple meal of jerky and a granola bar, washing it down with warm water from my canteen. Then I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Heavy. It came from behind me, just beyond the light of the fire. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A coyote? A mountain lion? I reached for my flashlight, my fingers gripping the cold metal as I turned it on and swung it around. Nothing. Just dry desert shrubs and the jagged outline of a rock formation. The breathing had stopped. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to relax. Maybe I had imagined it. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, the mind plays tricks. The quiet amplifies every sound. I shook my head, took one last look around, and sat back down. The fire crackled. The stars above seemed endless. And then, the breathing started again. This time, it was closer. I stood up, my pulse hammering. The sound was unmistakable, deep, slow breaths, just beyond the edge of the firelight. "Hello," I called, my voice hoarse. Silence. I grabbed my flashlight again and shined it into the bushes. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dry, twisted branches of a nearby shrub. I scanned the area, my heart pounding. Nothing moved. No sound. No footprints in the dirt. No shifting of leaves. I was alone. At least, I wanted to believe that. I swallowed hard, turned off the flashlight, and backed toward the fire. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the desert had its own strange way of breathing, a trick of the landscape. I sat down, but I didn't feel at ease. Every hair on my body stood on end. I stared into the flames, forcing myself to stay calm. I would sleep soon. I would wake up with the sun, pack my things, and hike back to my truck. Then I heard it again. This time, right behind me. I jumped up so fast I knocked over my canteen. The breathing was louder now, impossibly close. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the second the beam hit the bushes, the breathing stopped. I stood there, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't imagining this. Something was out there. Watching. Waiting. I scanned the area again, forcing myself to think logically. If it were an animal, it would have run by now. If it were a person, why weren't they saying anything? I felt exposed, standing there in the firelight, my back to the open desert. My instincts screamed at me to leave. Instead, I did the one thing that made sense. I put out the fire. The flames sputtered and died, and I stood in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust. My heart pounded in my ears, but I listened. Really listened. Silence. Nothing. I waited. A minute. 5 minutes. Nothing. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally escaped my lips. Maybe, just maybe, whoever or whatever it was had moved on. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. My knife was within reach. So was my flashlight. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the thin fabric walls of the tent. I told myself I was fine, that it was nothing. And then, the breathing started again. Inside the tent, right next to my head. I stopped breathing. I couldn't move. It was there. Right there. Something was inside with me. I felt the warmth of each exhale, slow and steady, inches from my face. I forced my hand toward my flashlight, fingers barely grazing the metal. I grabbed it and turned it on. The tent lit up instantly. Nothing was there. I scrambled out of the tent, my chest heaving, heart hammering. The desert stretched out, endless and empty. No footprints. No movement. I grabbed my backpack and shoved everything inside, not caring if I left something behind. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I just ran. I ran in the dark, my flashlight bouncing wildly, my breath ragged. Rocks shifted beneath my feet, but I didn't slow down. I kept moving, the way I had come, back toward my truck. It took me an hour, maybe more. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly collapsed. I yanked open the door, threw my gear inside, and locked every door. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the desert, the same shrubs, the same rocks. But I wasn't alone. Just beyond the reach of the headlights, at the very edge of darkness, something moved. Not an animal. Not a person. Something. I didn't stay to find out. I slammed the truck into gear and sped down the dirt road, dust rising in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching. I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again. Camping trips were a tradition for us. Me, Jake, and Ryan had been best friends since high school, and every summer, we picked a new location, packed up our gear, and spent a few nights out in the wild. It was a break from our routine lives. No phones, no distractions, just the three of us in nature. This time, we chose a remote forest deep in the Pacific Northwest. The place was isolated, no marked trails, no designated campsites. That's what made it perfect. We parked the truck at the end of an old dirt road, grabbed our gear, and hiked several miles into the dense woods. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. After about 3 hours of hiking, we found the perfect spot, a small clearing near a slow-moving river. The water was crystal clear, the ground was flat, and we had plenty of firewood around us. "Perfect," Jake said, dropping his pack. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, this'll do." We set up our tents, 3 individual ones, spaced a few feet apart. After collecting firewood, we built a fire pit and got a good flame going as the sun dipped behind the trees. Dinner was simple, canned chili and some jerky. We sat around the fire, laughing, reminiscing, and sharing stories the way we always did. At some point, Ryan got up to take a piss in the trees. Nothing unusual. He disappeared into the darkness for a minute or two, then came back, stretching his arms. "All right, I'm beat," he said. "Gonna hit the sack." Jake and I stayed up for another hour before calling it a night. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Peaceful. Safe. I woke up feeling well-rested. The sun was barely rising, and a soft mist hung in the air. Jake was still in his tent, snoring lightly. But Ryan's tent, wide open. At first, I thought maybe he had woken up early and gone to the river. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, and walked over to his. His sleeping bag was unzipped, but his backpack was still there, along with his boots. I frowned. No one walks barefoot in the woods. "Jake," I called. He groaned. "What?" "Ryan's not here." Jake sat up, rubbing his eyes. Maybe he went to take a dump? Without his boots? That woke him up. He unzipped his tent and stepped out, looking around. The fire was nothing but cold embers. The air was still. Too still. We checked the river first, then the surrounding woods, calling his name. No answer. By mid-morning, panic was creeping in. We searched in wider circles, looking for any sign of him. Footprints, broken branches, anything. Nothing. Jake and I were experienced enough to know the basics of search patterns. We marked our camp with bright fabric, then each took different directions, shouting Ryan's name every few minutes. Still nothing. By afternoon, we met back at camp. Jake was sweating, his face pale. "This doesn't make sense, man. Where the hell is he?" "We have to keep looking," I said, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. We went out again, this time pushing even deeper into the woods. That's when I noticed something odd. The birds, or rather, the lack of them. The forest had been full of noise yesterday, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the hum of insects. Now, dead silence. "Jake," I whispered. He turned. "What?" "Listen." We stood still. The only sound was our own breathing. Jake swallowed. "We should go back to camp." We retraced our steps carefully, marking trees as we went. As we neared the clearing, something caught my eye. Footprints. Barefoot. And they weren't ours. It was nearly dusk when we spotted him. Ryan was sitting in the middle of a small clearing about half a mile from our camp. His back was to us, his legs crossed. He wasn't moving. "Ryan," I called, relief flooding my chest. He didn't react. I moved closer, Jake following behind. "Dude, where the hell were you?" Still no reaction. Then I saw his face. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. Unblinking. "Ryan," I whispered, stepping in front of him. Nothing. No movement, no acknowledgement. Just that vacant, glassy stare. I reached out and touched his shoulder. His skin was ice cold. Jake grabbed him by the arm, shaking him. "Ryan, wake up." Ryan blinked. Just once. Then he turned his head slowly, like a rusty hinge. "What?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, what?" I said, my voice shaking. "Where the hell have you been?" Ryan frowned, his expression blank. I don't know." His voice was different. Slower. Flat. Jake and I exchanged a look. "Come on," I said. "Let's get back to camp." Ryan didn't move. For a long moment, I thought he wasn't going to. But then, almost mechanically, he stood up and followed us back. Back at camp, Ryan sat by the fire without speaking. "Do you remember anything?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "I went to sleep. And then, I was there." I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, Jake and I whispered in hushed voices outside the tent. "He's not okay, man," Jake muttered. "No shit." Jake exhaled. "We need to leave tomorrow. First thing." I nodded. "Yeah." I turned to glance at Ryan's tent. The flap was open just enough for me to see inside. Ryan was awake, staring right at me. He didn't blink. I didn't sleep. Morning came, and Ryan was gone. Again. Only this time, his tent was zipped shut. His boots were still there. His bag was untouched. But he was gone. No footprints. No sound. Just gone. Jake and I didn't hesitate. We grabbed our gear, left everything else behind, and hiked straight back to the truck. We never saw Ryan again. The police never found a trace. I had always preferred hiking alone. It wasn't because I didn't enjoy company. I just liked the solitude. The quiet of the woods, the steady rhythm of my footsteps, and the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. That summer, I planned a 3-day solo camping trip deep in the wilderness. I chose a trail that was long, rugged, and rarely traveled. It was about 15 miles into the forest, leading to a small, secluded lake. The plan was simple. Hike in on day 1, set up camp near the water, explore the area on day 2, then hike back out on day 3. I packed light, just the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, food, a small stove, a knife, a flashlight, and a GPS device. No cell service out there, but I was experienced enough to handle myself. I started the hike early in the morning. The sun was high, the air was warm but not stifling, and the trail was just as I expected, overgrown in places, winding through thick forest, completely silent except for the sounds of nature. Around noon, as I was making my way up a slight incline, I saw him. A man, coming down the trail from the opposite direction. He looked normal at first glance, mid-40s, average height, lean, with a short beard. He wore a gray t-shirt, hiking pants, and a too small backpack. That was the first thing that struck me as odd. Most hikers I passed on long trails had large backpacks, fully loaded with supplies. His pack looked like it could barely fit a bottle of water and a snack. As we got closer, I nodded. He nodded back. No words exchanged. His expression was blank, unreadable. I continued walking, dismissing the odd feeling in my stomach. People hiked with light packs sometimes. Maybe he was doing an ultralight hike. Maybe his camp was nearby. I didn't think much more about it. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, clear water, surrounded by tall trees, completely still. No signs of anyone else. No footprints, no old fire pits, nothing. I had the place to myself. I set up my tent in a small clearing, about 20 feet from the shore. Cooked a meal, sat by the water, and watched the sun dip below the tree line. That night, I slept well, until something woke me up. A sound. At first, I thought it was just the forest settling. A branch snapping in the distance. An animal moving through the underbrush. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the trail I had come from. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped. The night was silent again. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer. Maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I stayed still for a long time, heart pounding in my chest, then eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I shook off the unease and spent the day exploring the area. I hiked along the shoreline, fished a little, enjoyed the peace and quiet. By late afternoon, I started preparing dinner by my small fire when I felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. I forced myself to shake it off. I was alone. I had hiked deep into the woods. No one else should be out here. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The feeling hadn't left me. Every now and then, I looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Then I heard footsteps again. Not from the trail this time. From the tree-line, just outside my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, my knife, and stood up slowly. I turned toward the sound, flicking on the beam. The trees were thick, dense. The light barely penetrated the shadows. Then I saw him. The same man from the trail. Standing just beyond the reach of my light. Watching me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I gripped my knife tighter. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The man just stood there. Silent. Still. His face expressionless. I took a slow step forward. "Hey man, you alright?" He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the trees. Not back toward the trail. Deeper into the woods. I stood frozen, listening. No more footsteps. No breaking branches. It was as if he had disappeared into the night. My pulse pounded in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave, but I was miles from the trailhead. Hiking out in the dark was dangerous. I forced myself to think. Maybe he was just a weirdo. A lost hiker. Maybe he was harmless. I kept my knife close that night. Barely slept. The next day, I packed up early. I wanted to get out. I started hiking back, constantly checking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. By midday, I was 10 miles from the trailhead when I ran into a small group of hikers coming the other way. Relieved, I stopped to chat. "Have you seen anyone else on the trail?" I asked casually. One of them shook his head. "Nope. You're the first person we've seen all day." My stomach dropped. I described the man. The gray t-shirt. The small backpack. The way he was just standing there, watching me. They all exchanged uneasy looks. "Man, we haven't seen anyone. Are you sure?" I nodded slowly. My hands felt cold. If he wasn't a hiker, who was he? I hiked the rest of the way out without stopping. The whole time, I felt like something was just behind me, just out of sight. I reached my car, threw my gear inside, and got in. When I looked up at the trailhead one last time, a figure stood there, far down the path. Too far to see clearly, but I knew it was him. I turned the key, sped out of the parking lot, and never looked back. I told a park ranger about it later, but there were no missing persons reports, no abandoned campsites, no sign that anyone but me had been out there. I still don't know what he wanted. I only know one thing. I was never alone. I grew up camping. My dad had taken me out into the woods since before I could walk, and by the time I was in my 20s, it was second nature. I loved the quiet, the disconnect from everything. No phone, no emails, no distractions, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. That summer, I decided to do a solo camping trip. Nothing extreme, just a few nights in the backcountry of a national park I had visited a couple of times before. The plan was simple: hike 10 miles in, set up camp by a lake, spend 3 days fishing, relaxing, and enjoying the quiet, then hike back. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, food, small gas stove, knife, flashlight, GPS, and a first aid kit. It wasn't my first time alone in the woods, and I wasn't worried about much. But by the end of that trip, I would never camp alone again. The first day was perfect. The hike was long but steady, the weather was clear, and the deeper I got into the forest, the calmer I felt. There was something about being out there, away from roads and cities, that made the air feel different, lighter. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was as beautiful as I remembered: crystal clear water, thick trees surrounding it, not a soul in sight. No signs of campers, no old fire pits, just pure, untouched wilderness. I picked a flat spot a few hundred feet from the shoreline, just inside the tree line. It was tucked away enough to be hidden, but close enough to the lake for easy access. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and by the time the sun was starting to set, I had a small fire going. The first night was uneventful. I cooked, ate, sat by the fire, and eventually crawled into my tent, listening to the distant sounds of the woods as I drifted off to sleep. The second day was just as calm. I spent most of it fishing, exploring the area, and just soaking in the peace. The entire time, I didn't see a single person. No hikers, no other campers, no one. And yet, something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but by the afternoon, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I wasn't sure what I expected to see. An animal, maybe? A bear. But the deeper I listened, the more I realized what was bothering me. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling, just an overwhelming, unnatural silence. I tried to shake it off. Sometimes, the woods just got quiet. Animals moved on, the wind died down, it happened. But as the sun started setting, the feeling only grew stronger. Something wasn't right. That night, I built my fire a little bigger. I told myself it was just for warmth, but the truth was, I didn't like how dark the forest felt. I ate quickly and stayed close to the fire, scanning the trees every few minutes. My skin crawled with a weird sense of anticipation, like something was about to happen. Then, as I was about to put out the fire and head to my tent, I saw it. A footprint, right at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was mine, but when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. It was fresh, and it wasn't mine. It was slightly bigger, the shape a little different. And worse, it was facing my camp. I felt my whole body tense. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I had seen no signs of other campers, no distant campfires, nothing. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but all I saw was darkness. I told myself it was an old print. Maybe someone had camped here before me. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it earlier. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I slept with my knife in my hand that night. The next morning, I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to pack up and get out. But I convinced myself I was overreacting. I had 2 more days planned. I wasn't going to ruin the trip over a feeling. I forced myself to shake it off. I went fishing, tried to enjoy the quiet, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. And then, late in the afternoon, I saw him. A figure, deep in the trees, just standing there. I barely caught a glimpse, just a shape between the trunks, still as a statue. The moment I turned my head, he was gone. My whole body went cold. I wasn't alone. Someone was out here with me, watching me. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I stopped fishing. I stayed near my camp, constantly checking the trees. But I saw nothing. By the time the sun went down, I was terrified. I built my fire big again, sat with my knife in my lap, and listened. The forest was still silent. Too silent. Then, sometime deep into the night, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the tree line. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The steps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I forced myself to stay awake, scanning the dark, but I saw nothing. Finally, sometime before dawn, exhaustion took over, and I passed out. I woke up at first light, stiff and sore from sleeping in my chair. The fire was just glowing embers. And then I saw them. Footprints. They circled my camp. Someone had walked around my tent, watching me. That was it. I didn't care how far I had to hike. I was getting out. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. My hands were shaking the whole time. As I started hiking out, I forced myself not to run. The whole time, I expected to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in the trees. But I never did. The feeling, though, that feeling of being watched, never left me. I reached my car just after noon. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. Before I drove off, I glanced back at the tree line. Nothing. But I knew. Someone had been out there with me, and they had waited until my last night to make their presence known. I never camped alone again.